History honors Patty Duke's smile as a radiant symbol of America, but in truth, it was just a hollow muscle contraction designed to sell millions of cereal boxes, completely masking the abused child, terrified behind it. Her managers, the Rosses, stripped away her true identity with the mantra, "Anna is dead," while pumping her full of uppers and downers to keep the money-making machine running. Behind the Oscar glory was a life of confinement where she was cut off from her parents and forbidden to speak her own truth. When she regained her freedom at 18, Patty was shocked to find herself penniless. Her guardians had squandered every cent, leaving her with nothing but a mind permanently shattered by early chemical poisoning. John and Ethel Ross became Patty Duke's managers, specifically because they saw that her difficult family life made her easy to control. Born Anna Marie Pierce in Queens, she grew up in an unstable home with an alcoholic father who abandoned the family and a mother struggling with severe, untreated depression. With no strong parental protection or support system, she was left completely vulnerable, allowing the Rosses to easily step in and take charge of her life and career. It was into this fracture that John and Ethel Ross inserted themselves. They were not typical talent agents. They were a childless couple who specialized in the management of child actors. But management is a euphemism. They were architects of identity. They believed that a child star was not born, but manufactured. They saw children not as autonomous beings with rights and emotions, but as raw clay, lumps of potential revenue that needed to be sculpted, fired in the kiln of industry, and glazed with a false persona. They had already experienced a taste of success with a young actor named Bernadette Peters, but they were hungry for a definitive triumph. They wanted a star they could own completely. When they met Anna Marie Pierce, a scrawny, shy girl with a thick Queen's accent and sad eyes, they didn't see a child in need of protection. They saw an asset in need of refinement. The Rosses did not approach Frances Pierce with a business contract. They approached her with a lifeline. They understood that Frances was exhausted and terrified for her daughter's future. They played on her insecurities as a single mother. "She has talent," they told her, "but talent isn't enough. She needs polish. She needs the right environment. You can't give her that here." It was a cruel surgical strike at a mother's heart. They convinced Frances that her own love was insufficient, that her depression was a contagion that would ruin the child's chances. They painted a picture of a glittering future for Anna Marie: fame, wealth, stability. But they attached a non-negotiable condition. To save the child, the mother had to let her go. They argued that living in Queens was a hindrance. The commute to auditions was too long. The environment was too low class. They proposed that Anna Marie move into their Manhattan apartment. They promised to treat her like their own daughter, to educate her, to refine her. Frances Pierce, broken and believing she was doing the right thing for her daughter, agreed. She handed her child over to strangers, believing she was giving her a chance at life. In reality, she was handing her over to her jailers. The moment Anna Marie crossed the threshold of the Ross apartment, the airlock sealed. The transition was immediate and brutal. This was not a mentorship, it was a reprogramming camp. The first step in any cult-like indoctrination is the destruction of the subject's former identity. The Rosses knew that as long as the girl thought of herself as Anna Marie from Queens, she would retain a connection to her past, her family, and her sense of self. That connection had to be severed. One afternoon, early in her captivity, John Ross looked at the little girl with a cold, appraising stare. "Anna Marie is dead," he announced. "You are Patty now." The name choice was calculated marketing. At the time, Patty McCormick was a successful child star, famous for The Bad Seed, The Rosses wanted to draft off that brand equity. They wanted a name that sounded peppy, all-American, and non-ethnic. Anna Marie sounded too Catholic, too immigrant, too working class. Patty Duke sounded like a cheerleader, a girl who drank milkshakes and obeyed her parents. But the erasure went deeper than the name. The Rosses despised her voice. The Queen's accent, the flat vowels, the dropped R's, was viewed as a deformity. They spent hours drilling it out of her. They forced her to repeat phrases until her throat was raw, molding her voice into a sterile, placid, standard American broadcast accent. They weren't just teaching her diction. They were teaching her that her natural way of speaking was shameful. They were teaching her that her origins were dirty. They fabricated her history. They instructed her to lie about her background during auditions. They shaved 2 years off her age, telling casting directors she was younger to make her talent seem more precocious. For a child, this creates a profound psychological schism. She was forced to murder her own identity every morning. There was Anna, the frightened girl locked inside the ribcage, and there was Patty, the vivacious invention who walked and talked and smiled for the adults. This wasn't method acting. It was the genesis of a dissociative fracture that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The Rosses understood that for their control to be absolute, they had to be the only source of affection and authority in the girl's life. They systematically dismantled her relationship with her parents. Her father, John, was banned entirely. The Rosses framed him as a dangerous drunk, a monster to be feared. While his alcoholism was real, the Rosses weaponized it to ensure Anna Marie would never look to him for help. The treatment of her mother, Frances, was even more insidious. Frances was not banned, she was repurposed. The Rosses allowed her to visit the apartment, but not as a mother. She was permitted to come over to do the laundry. Imagine the psychological horror of this dynamic. The young girl, now living in a high-rise, watching her own mother come in the back door to wash the underwear of the people who had stolen her child. Anna Marie was forbidden from showing excessive affection to her mother. No crying, no clinging, no long hugs. The Rosses drilled a poison mantra into the girl's head, repeating it until it became her reality. Your parents are failures. They didn't want you. They gave you away. We are the only ones who love you. We are the only ones who can save you. They turned the mother into a servant and the daughter into a princess in a tower, creating a class divide between them that made intimacy impossible. Frances Pierce became a ghost in her daughter's life, a silent woman folding sheets while Patty Duke was groomed for the spotlight. The Ross apartment was not a home. It was a correctional facility designed to break the will. The control they exerted over Patty's physical body was total. Privacy was abolished. Patty was forbidden from closing the bathroom door. Whether she was using the toilet or taking a bath, the door had to remain open. John Ross would stand in the doorway, watching. He would walk in while she was in the tub, claiming he needed to check on her hygiene to ensure she was scrubbing properly. This was manipulative control disguised as guardianship. It was a tactic to undermine her independence. He convinced her that her life belonged to the Patty Duke Corporation, where he was CEO. He distorted her reality, portraying his oversight as coaching or parental care. A child lacks the words to resist. When caregivers mistreat you, you blame yourself and see it as normal. The atmosphere in the apartment was one of high-wire tension. Ethel Ross was the enforcer, a woman of volatile moods and cruel punishments. The most harrowing example of their methodology involved food. The Rosses controlled every calorie Patty consumed. They kneaded her thin, waif-like, an eternal child. But occasionally, the control shifted to force feeding. One evening, Ethel decided Patty had not eaten enough. She piled a plate high with food. Patty, whose stomach was knotted with anxiety and shrunk from the stimulants she was already being fed, could not finish it. Ethel did not let her leave the table. She forced the girl to eat until she gagged. When Patty inevitably vomited onto the plate, Ethel Ross did not show mercy. She showed her the face of a monster. She called the girl wasteful. She called her ungrateful, and then she forced Patty to eat her own vomit. This act was not about nutrition. It was about degradation. It was about proving that they could force her to do anything, no matter how revulsive, no matter how humiliating. It was the breaking of the horse. It established a hierarchy where the Rosses were gods, and Patty was less than an animal. By the time she was 12 years old, Anna Marie Pierce had been completely hollowed out. In her place stood Patty Duke, a polished, smiling, obedient vessel ready to be filled with drugs, lines, and the expectations of an entire industry. The clay had been fired. The product was ready for market. With the psychological conditioning complete, the Rosses had successfully created a compliant vessel, but they soon encountered a barrier that psychological manipulation alone could not overcome: the biological limits of a human child. A 12-year-old girl, no matter how obedient, requires sleep, gets bored, and physically flags after hours under the studio lights. To the Rosses, these natural rhythms were not needs to be respected, but inefficiencies to be eliminated. To maximize the yield of their asset, they realized they needed to control her internal chemistry just as rigidly as they controlled her external environment. If part 1 was the story of a kidnapping, part 2 is the story of the weaponization of the hostage. By the late 1950s, the Patty Duke construct was fully operational. The girl from Queens, Anna Marie, had been successfully repressed, locked away behind a wall of manufactured charm and terrifying obedience. But John and Ethel Ross faced a logistical problem inherent to the entertainment industry: the limitations of human biology. They did not turn to better scheduling or more rest. They turned to pharmacology. The drugging of Patty Duke was not recreational. It was functional. It was industrial maintenance applied to a human being. It began at the breakfast table. Alongside her orange juice and vitamins, the Rosses introduced a new regimen. They administered heavy doses of amphetamines, specifically dexedrine. In the 1950s, these drugs were sometimes used for diet control, but the Rosses used them for their stimulant properties. The effect on the adolescent brain is profound. The drugs flooded her system with dopamine and norepinephrine. They dilated her pupils, suppressed her appetite, and induced a state of hyperfocus and artificial euphoria. Under the influence of speed, Patty could memorize entire scripts in a single reading. She could perform with manic energy for 12, 14, 16 hours a day. She was electric, charming, and tireless. She was the perfect employee. But you cannot simply turn off a child who is high on amphetamines. When the cameras stopped rolling and the Rosses brought her back to the apartment, Patty was vibrating. Her heart raced, her mind spun at 1,000 revolutions per minute. She physically could not sleep. To counter this, the Rosses introduced the second half of the cocktail, the downers. They fed her heavy barbiturates like Seconal and Nembutal, drugs powerful enough to knock out a grown man. When pills weren't enough, they utilized alcohol. It is a chilling image. John and Ethel Ross mixing vodka or whiskey highballs for a 13-year-old girl to wash down her tranquilizers. They would administer this chemical bludgeon until she passed out, granting them a few hours of silence before they woke her up to inject her with speed again. This upper-downer cycle is chemically torturous. It destroys the body's natural circadian rhythms. It wreaks havoc on the endocrine system. But most devastatingly, it destroys the mind. What the Rosses did not know, or perhaps simply did not care to investigate, was that Anna Marie Pierce carried a latent genetic predisposition for bipolar disorder. The adolescent brain is already a volatile chemical environment. By subjecting her to extreme peaks of chemically induced mania and extreme valleys of chemically induced depression, they were not just managing her energy. They were actively rewiring her neurology. They were pouring gasoline on the spark of a severe mental illness, creating a cycle of instability that would torture her for decades. While the Rosses were poisoning her body, they were also corrupting her moral compass. They needed money and they needed fame to get it. In 1959, the quickest route to both was the television game show. The $64,000 question was a cultural phenomenon. It promised that ordinary Americans could win fortunes simply by being smart. The Rosses managed to get Patty on the show as a contestant. Her category was spelling. The public saw a precocious, adorable 12-year-old girl in a pinafore, furrowing her brow, thinking hard, and coming up with the correct letters. It was heartwarming. It was also a complete fabrication. The show was rigged. The producers, in collusion with the Rosses, fed Patty the answers beforehand. They didn't just give her the words, they coached her performance. "Wait before you answer," they told her. "Bite your lip. Look up at the ceiling like you're praying. Make them think you're unsure." Patty, the consummate actress, performed the role of the anxious contestant perfectly. She won $32,000, a massive sum in 1959. The money, of course, went directly into the accounts controlled by the Rosses. But the true cost came later. When the quiz show scandals broke, revealing the widespread fraud, the United States Congress launched an investigation. Patty Duke, then still a child, was subpoenaed to testify before a Senate committee. The Rosses were terrified. If Patty told the truth, that she had been fed the answers, their careers were over. They would be exposed as frauds and child exploiters. So they did what they always did. They threatened her. They drove her to Washington, D.C., and told her that if she told the truth, she would go to jail. They told her she would be taken away from them, the only family she had. They coached her on how to lie to the federal government. Patty sat before the grim-faced senators and lied. She committed perjury. She swore under oath that she had won the money fair and square. For a Catholic girl raised with a strict sense of sin, this was a spiritual death blow. She later described this moment as the point where she believed she was damned. She wasn't just an actress anymore. She was a liar, a criminal. She internalized a deep, corrosive shame. She believed she was a bad seed, a fraud who was fooling the world. This self-loathing became the psychological bedrock upon which the Rosses built their control. "You are bad," the logic went, "so you deserve what we do to you." Amidst the fraud and the abuse, a strange paradox emerged. Patty Duke was becoming a genuinely brilliant actress. The trauma she was enduring gave her access to a well of emotional depth that most child actors could not touch. This culminated in The Miracle Worker, first on Broadway, and then in the 1962 film. Patty played the young Helen Keller. It was a role that required no dialogue, only raw physical expression of rage, confusion, and eventual enlightenment. The role was grueling. It involved violent physical fights on stage every night. But for Patty, it was cathartic. On stage, she was allowed to scream. She was allowed to break things. She was allowed to fight back against Anne Bancroft, playing Annie Sullivan. It was the only place in her life where her rage was permitted, even celebrated. She won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress at age 16. She was the youngest person in history to win the award at that time. The footage of her acceptance speech is haunting. She stands at the podium clutching the statue, looking small and fragile. She says, "Thank you," and then simply walks away. She looks terrified. Behind the scenes, the Oscar didn't bring freedom. It brought tighter chains. The Rosses now possessed an Academy Award winner. The asset had appreciated in value. The surveillance increased, the isolation deepened. They moved her to a new, more expensive apartment, paid for by her earnings. But the rules remained. No bathroom privacy, no friends, no contact with her family. In 1963, the television industry capitalized on her fame with The Patty Duke Show. The premise of the sitcom is famous: identical cousins. They laugh alike, they walk alike, at times they even talk alike. One cousin, Kathy, was quiet, studious, and demure. The other, Patty, was wild, boisterous, and typically American. To the audience, it was a cute gimmick. To Patty Duke, it was a documentary of her own fractured psyche. Sidney Sheldon, the show's creator, had spent time with Patty living with the Rosses. He noticed the strange dichotomy in her personality, the manic highs and the depressive, withdrawn lows. He didn't realize he was witnessing the symptoms of bipolar disorder and drug abuse. He thought he was seeing two different personalities. He wrote the show based on her mental illness. Filming the show was a nightmare of logistics and endurance. Because she played both leads, Patty was in almost every frame. She had to memorize double the lines. She had to act against a body double, then change costumes and act the other side of the scene. The Rosses ramped up the drug regimen to keep her functioning. The amphetamines kept her flying through the 12-hour shoot days. The vodka brought her down at night. On set, the cracks began to widen. Fueled by the uppers and her untreated mania, Patty became erratic. She would have wild outbursts of temper. She would hallucinate. She became obsessively thin, her body wasting away under the metabolic fire of the stimulants. The crew whispered that she was a spoiled brat or difficult. They didn't know they were watching a teenager in the grips of a chemically induced psychosis. By age 17, the atmosphere in the Ross apartment had grown intensely volatile. Patty had matured into a young woman, fueled by teenage urges and defiance heightened by her manic state. The Rosses controlled her social life with the same strictness they applied to her eating habits, prohibiting her from seeing boys, overseeing her communications and belittling her appearance, insisting she was unattractive and undesirable. But the biology they tried to suppress was fighting back. The pressure inside Anna Marie Pierce was building to a critical mass. The Patty Duke mask was slipping. The girl who had been erased was trying to claw her way back to the surface. And since she had no tools for healthy rebellion, she was heading toward a catastrophic explosion. The world saw a sitcom star. The Rosses saw a meal ticket. But looking back at the footage from 1964, a forensic eye sees something else entirely. A girl standing on the edge of a cliff, screaming for help in a language no one spoke. The chemical containment system that had held Anna Marie prisoner for nearly a decade was beginning to fail. As she transitioned from a malleable child into a young woman, the volatile combination of hormones, amphetamines, and untreated mania created a pressure that the Rosses could no longer suppress with threats or pills. The perfect machine began to glitch, sparking a desperate need for liberation that would lead to a dramatic exit, only for her to discover that the door she kicked open led not to freedom, but to a barren wasteland of financial ruin. By 1965, the psychological architecture of the Ross regime was beginning to buckle under the weight of biological reality. John and Ethel Ross had successfully controlled a child, but controlling an 18-year-old woman with a genius-level IQ and a simmering chemically fueled rage was a different equation entirely. The end of the Patty Duke show marked the end of her containment. The show had been her cell block, a structured 12-hour-a-day environment where her mania was harnessed for profit. When the cameras stopped rolling, the structure collapsed, and the energy that had been channeled into Patty Lane and Kathy Lane had nowhere to go but outward. We are now entering the most chaotic chapter of her life. It is the story of a desperate escape, a devastating financial betrayal, and the terrifying realization that freedom from her captors did not mean freedom from her own mind. In the classic narrative of the prisoner, escape usually requires an accomplice. For Patty Duke, that accomplice was Harry Falk. Falk was an assistant director on the Patty Duke show. He was 13 years her senior, a quiet, steady presence in the chaotic storm of the set. To the Rosses, he was a nobody, staff essentially. But to Patty, he represented something she had never experienced, an adult male who did not want to own her, change her, or exploit her. He simply listened to her. The romance that developed was not a fairy tale, it was a survival strategy. Patty realized that in 1965 America, a young girl could not simply walk out of her legal guardian's home. She needed a legal transfer of authority. Marriage was the only key that unlocked the door of the Ross apartment. The Rosses, with the instincts of predators who sensed the herd moving, were terrified. They saw Falk not as a suitor, but as a thief coming to steal their retirement fund. They launched a campaign of psychological warfare to stop the union. They told Patty that Falk was only after her money, a projection of their own motives. They forbade her from seeing him. They screamed, threatened, and wept. But the Rosses had made a fatal miscalculation. They had spent years feeding Patty amphetamines to make her strong and aggressive for her work. Now, that chemically induced aggression was turned against them. In a scene that rivals any drama she ever filmed, 18-year-old Patty Duke stood in the living room of the apartment that had been her prison for a decade. She looked at John and Ethel Ross, the people who had forced her to eat vomit, who had drugged her, who had molested her privacy, and she told them she was leaving. She walked out with nothing but the clothes on her back. She left the Oscars. She left the memorabilia. She left the childhood she never had. She moved into a small apartment with Harry Falk, believing she had finally reached the promised land. Once the euphoria of the escape faded, the practical reality of adulthood set in. Patty assumed she was a wealthy woman. She had been the star of a hit Broadway play, a hit film, and a top-rated sitcom that ran for over 100 episodes. She was a household name, a merchandising juggernaut whose face was on board games, dolls, and record albums. In today's economy, a star of her magnitude would have been worth tens of millions of dollars. Even in 1965, she should have been a millionaire. She and Harry Falk hired lawyers to untangle her finances from the Rosses. They went to the bank to inspect the accounts that John Ross had managed for her since she was 7 years old. They opened the vault and they found air. It was gone, all of it. The forensic accounting of the theft reveals the depth of the Rosses' depravity. They hadn't just skimmed off the top, they had devoured the whole carcass. They took a 15% manager's fee, then a 5% personal representative fee. They charged the cost of their own lavish lifestyle to Patty's earnings. Their apartment, their clothes, their meals, their vacations. It was all billed as business expenses necessary to maintain the star's image. Patty Duke, the teenager who had worked 16-hour days while high on speed, had less than nothing. But the cruelty went deeper than simple theft. The Rosses had not paid her taxes. Because they had classified her earnings as their income to spend, but her income to declare, the Internal Revenue Service came knocking. At 18 years old, having just escaped a decade of captivity, Patty Duke was handed a bill for back taxes that amounted to a fortune she did not possess. The betrayal was total. The mantra the Rosses had drilled into her head, "We are the only ones who love you. Your parents didn't want you," was revealed as the lie it always was. They didn't love her. They were parasites who had attached themselves to a host and fed until there was nothing left but bone. Betrayed, broke, and furious, Anna Marie Pierce decided to commit a public execution. She wanted to kill Patty Duke, the wholesome, smiling, lying construct the Rosses had built. Her weapon of choice was the 1967 film Valley of the Dolls. Based on the scandalous bestseller by Jacqueline Suzanne, the film was a tawdry, campy, drug-fueled melodrama. It was the antithesis of the Patty Duke show. Patty signed on to play Neely O'Hara, a pill-popping, alcoholism-ravaged singer who destroys her own life. The public was horrified. America's sweetheart was suddenly on screen screaming obscenities, engaging in catfights and wallowing in addiction. Critics savaged the film. They savaged her performance. They called it grotesque. But they were missing the point. For Patty, this wasn't acting. It was a primal scream. When she played Neely O'Hara, a woman destroying herself with pills and booze, she was playing the reality of her life with the Rosses. She was showing the world the ugly, manic, drug-addled truth that had been hidden behind the sitcom laugh track. It was career suicide, and she didn't care. She was trying to burn the house down. However, escaping the Rosses did not cure her. In fact, removing their iron-fisted control triggered a terrifying escalation in her behavior. Without the strict schedule of the show and the enforced discipline of her managers, Patty's undiagnosed bipolar disorder ran wild. The amphetamines she had taken for years had masked the natural cycles of the illness, but they had also exacerbated the manic phases. Now, free to do as she pleased, she entered a state of perpetual, terrifying mania. Her marriage to Harry Falk began to disintegrate. Patty was a hurricane of externalized chaos. This phase of her mania was defined by a pathological need to consume and display. Though she was in debt to the IRS, whenever she got a paycheck, she would spend it instantly. She would go to a department store and buy 10 coats in every color. She would buy cars she couldn't drive. She would rent expensive homes she couldn't afford. It was the classic symptom of bipolar mania, the loss of impulse control. But in the 1960s, no one recognized it. They just thought she was an out-of-control celebrity living a life of excess. Her weight fluctuated violently. She would starve herself until she was skeletal, then binge eat until she ballooned. She was trying to control the chaos inside her by controlling the size of her body. Harry Falk tried to save her. He loved her. But he was watching his wife descend into madness, and he had no tools to stop it. He begged her to get help. She refused. She didn't believe she was sick. She believed she was bad. The Rosses had taught her that she was fundamentally flawed. So she interpreted her mania not as a symptom, but as a sin. The most public display of her disintegration came at the 1970 Emmy Awards. Patty won for her role in the TV movie My Sweet Charlie. When she walked up to the podium, she was in the grip of a manic episode. She was disheveled. Her speech was rambling, disjointed, and bizarre. She spoke about being reincarnated. She stared wildly at the audience. The room was silent. The applause was polite but confused. People looked at each other, whispering, "What is wrong with Patty Duke? Is she on drugs? Is she drunk?" They were watching a mental breakdown broadcast live to millions of people, But because mental health was a taboo subject, no one intervened. They simply labeled her eccentric or difficult and looked away. By the end of the 1960s, Patty Duke was alone again. Her marriage to Harry Falk collapsed under the weight of her illness. She was divorced, deep in debt, and living in a chaotic state of untreated psychosis. She began to self-medicate heavily with alcohol to quiet the voices in her head. She entered a series of disastrous, impulsive relationships. In a manic fugue state, she married a stranger she rented an apartment from, a marriage that lasted only days. She became pregnant, unsure of who the father was, a scandal that the tabloids feasted upon. She was living in a canyon house in Los Angeles, surrounded by garbage bags full of unopened mail and unpaid bills. She would sit in the dark, rocking back and forth, listening to the wind, terrified that she was losing her mind completely. The Rosses were gone, but they had left a time bomb in her brain, and it had finally exploded. The invisible prisoner was no longer trapped in an apartment in Manhattan. She was trapped in the labyrinth of her own neurology. She had survived the crime of her childhood, but the question now was whether she could survive the freedom of her adulthood. She was Anna Marie Pierce, 23 years old, a legend, a pauper, and a woman standing on the precipice of total insanity. By the early 1970s, Patty Duke had become a cautionary tale in the Hollywood ecosystem. To the public, she was a train wreck, a former child star who had gone wrong, prone to scandalous affairs, bizarre public outbursts, and a chaotic personal life. The tabloids feasted on her instability, framing her behavior as the typical excesses of a spoiled celebrity. But looking back with a forensic medical lens, we can see that Patty was not acting out. She was suffering from a catastrophic, untreated medical emergency. The Ross regime was gone, but the chemical and psychological damage they had inflicted was compounding with her genetic biology. She was trapped in a cycle of rapid cycling bipolar disorder, living life at 100 miles per hour with no brakes, heading straight for a cliff. Nothing illustrates the intense chaos of her manic episode more vividly than the controversy over her first son's birth. In 1970, Patty experienced heightened manic energy, a typical bipolar symptom involving an urgent drive for emotional and sensory experiences to calm inner turmoil. Over a short period, she had relationships with 3 men: D.C. Arnaz Jr., Lucille Ball's son, John Astin from the Addams Family, and Michael Tell, a rock promoter she hardly knew. In a manic fugue state, seemingly trying to create stability out of chaos, she married Michael Tell. The marriage lasted 13 days. It was an impulsive, delirious act that she barely remembered later. When she discovered she was pregnant, the timeline was a blur. She was terrified. In her mind, she constructed a narrative to make sense of the confusion. She told the world and herself that the father was John Astin, the man she truly loved and would eventually marry. On February 25, 1971, Sean Astin was born. He would grow up to be a beloved actor in The Goonies and The Lord of the Rings. For decades, Sean was raised believing John Astin was his biological father. It wasn't until DNA testing decades later that the truth revealed Michael Tell was the father. This episode is often cited as evidence of Patty's wildness. In reality, it was evidence of her sickness. The mania had robbed her of the ability to track time, consequences, or reality. She was a woman drowning in her own life, clutching at John Astin as a raft in the storm. The marriage to John Astin brought a semblance of structure, but you cannot structure away a chemical imbalance. The 1970s were a decade of torture for Patty. She continued to work, delivering incredible performances, but her internal life was a horror show. Her condition had evolved from external outbursts to a private physical torment. During these manic highs, it wasn't just about spending money. It was about an inability to exist in stillness. She would stay awake for days, not out of choice, but because her body refused to shut down. She engaged in obsessive-compulsive behaviors, such as cleaning the house with a toothbrush or rearranging furniture at 3 a.m., desperate to burn off the energy. She felt like she was vibrating, as if her skin couldn't contain her energy. During the depressive lows, she would retreat into bed, unable to move, crushed by a weight of despair so heavy she physically hurt. She would cry for hours without knowing why. Suicide became a constant companion. She attempted to take her own life multiple times during this period. These were not cries for attention. They were attempts to stop the pain. She later described the sensation as her brain being on fire. She simply wanted to put the fire out. The tragedy was that she still believed the Rosses' lie. She believed this chaos was a moral failing. She thought she was crazy. She thought she was born bad. She hid her symptoms as best she could, terrified that if anyone knew the truth, she would be locked away in an asylum forever. The pivotal moment arrived in 1982, marking the most significant year in Anna Marie Pierce's life. Her actions had grown increasingly unpredictable, with her downturns posing serious risks, prompting her to consult a new psychiatrist. Unlike the earlier physicians influenced by the Ross family, or who labeled her merely as an overly emotional performer, this one truly heard her out. He reviewed her past, the insomnia, extravagant purchases, heightened intimacy drives, and profound bouts of despair. He also considered her familial background. Ultimately, he provided her with a diagnosis: manic depressive illness, manic depression, today known as bipolar disorder. For most people, a diagnosis of severe mental illness is a devastating blow. For Patty Duke, it was a reprieve from a death sentence. She sat in that office and wept, not from fear, but from relief. The diagnosis meant she wasn't evil. It meant she wasn't a spoiled brat. It meant she wasn't a failure. It meant she had a disease, just like diabetes, just like cancer. And crucially, it meant there was a treatment. The doctor prescribed lithium. It is a simple element, a salt, but in the history of psychiatry, it is a miracle drug. The effect was not immediate, but when it settled in, it was profound. For the first time in her life, perhaps since she was 7 years old, the noise in Patty Duke's head stopped. The racing thoughts slowed down. The crushing weight of depression lifted. She described it as the ocean finally becoming calm after a 30-year hurricane. She could sleep. She could eat. She could sit in a chair and read a book without feeling like she needed to run a marathon. The stabilization of Patty Duke is one of the great medical success stories of Hollywood, but the medication forced her to confront a new reality. If her behavior had been caused by a chemical imbalance, what did that mean about her past? What did that mean about the Rosses? It meant she had been fighting a war on two fronts, one against her abusers and one against her own biology. And she had survived both. With her mind finally clear, Anna Marie Pierce decided it was time to reclaim the narrative. She realized that Patty Duke was a fiction created by John and Ethel Ross, a mask she had worn for too long. In 1987, she published her autobiography, Call Me Anna. Celebrity memoirs are usually fluffy, self-serving vanity projects. Call Me Anna was a Molotov cocktail. She revealed everything without hesitation. She recounted the mistreatment in the apartment, identifying John and Ethel Ross as her abusers. She explained the forced drug injections and the consumption of vomit, along with the stolen finances. Yet the most startling revelation was her account of her psychological condition. In 1987, celebrities did not talk about being crazy. It was a career killer. Mental illness was still viewed with fear and stigma. Patty Duke broke that taboo with a sledgehammer. She wrote openly about the mania, the suicide attempts, and the lithium. The public reaction was explosive. The book became a bestseller. It was turned into a television movie. But more importantly, it started a conversation. Thousands of people wrote to her. They told her that her story had saved them. They told her that because she, an Oscar winner, a TV star, had admitted to having bipolar disorder, they finally felt brave enough to seek help. She had transformed from a victim of the industry into a pioneer for mental health. As she regained her strength, she also turned her eye toward the industry that had allowed her to be devoured. In 1985, Patty Duke was elected president of the Screen Actors Guild, SAG. This was not a ceremonial role. She was the head of the union. She used her power to advocate for the very protection she never had. She fought for stricter enforcement of child labor laws. She fought for better hours. She fought for the protection of young actors' earnings. It was a poetic justice. The girl who had been enslaved by the studio system was now the woman running the union that regulated it. She stood across the negotiating table from the studio heads, the successors of the men who had exploited her, and she demanded respect. As president of the Screen Actors Guild, she didn't just pose for photos. She pored over the fine print of contracts, the same kind of contracts that had enslaved her. She hardened the rules regarding the education and financial protection of child actors. She ensured that the Coogan law was strictly enforced. She was the shepherd who had been eaten by wolves, now standing guard over the flock. However, the story does not end with a happily ever after. Lithium treats bipolar disorder. It does not cure it. And it certainly does not cure the PTSD of a childhood spent in captivity. Even with the medication, Patty struggled. The damage to her body from the years of drug abuse and anorexia was permanent. Her relationships with her children, Sean and Mackenzie Aston, were complicated by the years of chaos before her diagnosis. She had to do the hard work of rebuilding trust with her sons, explaining that the crazy mom of their childhood was gone, replaced by Anna. She spent the 1990s and 2000s working constantly, touring the country as a speaker on mental health. But there was always a fragility to her. She carried the scars of the Ross regime in her eyes. She had defeated the Rosses. She had defeated the mania. But she could not defeat the final enemy, the physical toll of a life lived in the red zone. With the diagnosis of manic depression and the stabilization provided by lithium, Anna Marie Pierce had won the war for her mind. Yet the collateral damage of that 30-year battle remained. The psychological exorcism was complete, but the physical vessel, the body that had been starved, drugged, and stressed to the breaking point since childhood, began to present the bill for the trauma it had absorbed. As she moved into the next phase of her life, the focus shifted from fighting for her sanity to surviving the biological aftermath of her survival. By the turn of the millennium, Anna Marie Pierce, known to the world as Patty Duke, had achieved a victory that seemed impossible in 1970. She was alive, she was sane, she was solvent. But trauma is not just a ghost in the mind. It is a physical tenant in the body. The field of modern psychology tells us that the body keeps the score. The nervous system, once wired for terror and flooded with cortisol and adrenaline during developmental years, does not simply reset because the danger has passed. The final act of Patty Duke's life was defined by two opposing forces: the failing of her physical machinery ravaged by the Ross regime, and the blossoming of her spiritual legacy as she found peace far away from the Hollywood hills. In her 50s and 60s, the structural integrity of her body began to fail, specifically her cardiovascular system. Years of amphetamine abuse and the constant fight-or-flight mode of her childhood had placed an impossible load on her heart. In 2004, this manifested in a terrifying way, and she underwent single bypass heart surgery. It was a stark reminder that while her mind was healed by lithium, her heart still bore the scars of the adrenaline-soaked panic of her youth. She faced these ailments with a grim survivor's humor. She often joked that it was a miracle she was standing at all. But to the forensic eye, her medical chart was a crime scene map. Every ailment could be traced back to the apartment in Manhattan where John and Ethel Ross played chemist with a little girl's life. If lithium saved her mind, Idaho saved her soul. In 1986, while working on a television movie, Patty met Michael Pierce. He was not a producer. He was not a director. He was a drill sergeant in the United States Army. He was a man of structure, discipline, and quiet strength, the antithesis of the chaotic, narcissistic men who had previously populated her life. They married in 1986. In 1990, they made a radical decision. They left Hollywood. They moved to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, a quiet, rugged town in the Pacific Northwest. This move was a final rejection of the industry. In Los Angeles, she was Patty Duke, the former child star. In Idaho, she was just Anna. She shopped at the grocery store without makeup. She attended church. She bought a farm. She adopted dogs. For a woman who had been raised in a high-rise prison, forced to perform for her supper, the anonymity of Idaho was a sanctuary. For the first time in her life, she was not being watched. There were no cameras. There were no John and Ethel Ross standing in the bathroom doorway. She found a peace in the mundane rhythms of rural life that fame had never provided. She described sitting on her porch, watching the snowfall, and realizing that silence wasn't scary anymore. It was just silence. The greatest test of a survivor of child abuse is parenting. The statistics are grim. Abused children often become abusive parents. The Ross regime had taught Patty that love was control, that discipline was humiliation, and that children were property. She had to unlearn everything. Her relationship with her sons, Sean Astin and Mackenzie Astin, is the moral center of her adult life. During her unmedicated years in the 1970s, she had subjected them to the chaos of her mania. They had seen her rages. They had lived through her instability. But she broke the cycle. She did not abuse them. She did not exploit them. She did not force them to work to support her. When Sean and Mackenzie entered the acting world, Patty was terrified. She watched them like a hawk ready to tear out the throat of anyone who tried to Ross them, but she also gave them the one thing she never had: autonomy. After her diagnosis and stabilization, she spent years repairing the relationship. She sat them down and explained the illness. She apologized. She didn't make excuses. She offered context. Sean Astin, in his own memoir, speaks of her with immense love and forgiveness. He acknowledged the chaos, but he also acknowledged the ferocious love she had for them. She had succeeded where her own mother had failed. She protected her children from the wolves, even when the wolf was inside her own head. In the 1950s, Patty Duke was forced to testify before the U.S. Senate and lie to protect a corrupt industry. In the 2000s, she returned to Washington, D.C., but this time, she told the truth to save lives. She became a relentless lobbyist for mental health parity. She argued that mental illness should be treated by insurance companies the same way they treat heart disease or cancer. She traveled the country speaking in high school gymnasiums and church basements. She didn't speak as a celebrity. She spoke as a patient. She told the ugly stories, the mania, the suicide attempts, the shame. She famously said, "I survived for a reason. She believed that her suffering had a purpose, to be a lighthouse for others lost in the storm of bipolar disorder. There is a profound symmetry in this. The voice that the Rosses had tried to erase, the Anna Marie voice they hated, became one of the most powerful voices in the American mental health movement. They had tried to silence her. Instead, they inadvertently created a warrior. As she entered her late 60s, Patty Duke began to slow down. The energy that had once fueled her performances was waning, but she remained vigilant. She watched the new generation of child stars, Lindsay Lohan, Britney Spears, Amanda Bynes, being chewed up by the 24-hour news cycle and the paparazzi. She saw the same patterns repeating: the exploitative parents, the exhaustion, the public breakdowns labeled as bad behavior. She spoke out for them. When the world mocked Britney Spears for shaving her head, Patty Duke didn't laugh. She recognized the act of a woman trying to reclaim ownership of her body. She recognized the primal scream. She warned us. She told us that the machine hadn't stopped, it had just gotten faster. She reminded us that we, the audience, were still buying the tickets to the execution. In 2016, the body that had endured so much finally signaled that it was done. But before we cover the final moments, we must acknowledge the triumph of her final decade. She didn't die a victim. She died a grandmother, a mother and a wife, living in a house she owned, with a name she chose in a life she built from the ashes of a crime scene. Anna Marie had found her sanctuary in the mountains of Idaho, building a life of quiet dignity that defied every prediction made for her. However, the legacy of the Ross regime was written into her very cells, a dormant threat that no amount of peace or advocacy could fully erase. In the end, it was not the mind that faltered, but the exhausted machinery of the body itself, leading to a final physical rupture that would close the book on a life defined by extraordinary resilience. On March 29, 2016, the news broke across the wires. Patty Duke, the Oscar-winning actress, was dead at the age of 69. The headlines were respectful, celebrating her as America's sweetheart and the miracle worker. They ran montages of her beaming face from The Patty Duke Show and clips of her accepting her Academy Award. But the official cause of death, sepsis from a ruptured intestine, tells a darker final truth. It is the last piece of forensic evidence in the case against the industry that raised her. Patty Duke did not die of old age. She died because her body, pushed beyond its design limits for 60 years, finally suffered a catastrophic structural failure. To understand her death, we must look at the biology of the intestine. It is an organ highly sensitive to stress, nutrition, and chemical balance. For a decade of her developmental life, Patty Duke's digestive system was a battleground. It was flooded with heavy barbiturates and alcohol. It was starved during her anorexic phases and violently assaulted during her bulimic phases. It was subjected to chronic, extreme levels of cortisol from living in a state of terror. A ruptured intestine is a violent event. It is the body breaching its own containment. While we cannot say with absolute medical certainty that the abuse caused the specific rupture in 2016, we can say that the Ross regime built the foundation for her physical fragility. They weakened the vessel. Her death was the final echo of the crime committed in 1959. The predators were long dead, but the damage they inflicted had a half-life of half a century. However, if we view her death only as a tragedy, we miss the point of her life. The true miracle of Patty Duke is not that she won an Oscar at 16, it is that she lived to be 69. Statistically, Anna Marie Pierce should have died in the 1970s. She should have been another Judy Garland or Marilyn Monroe, a star consumed by the void, found dead of an overdose in a lonely room. The trajectory of her abuse pointed toward early self-destruction. But she refused to follow the script. She rewrote the ending. Before Patty Duke, mental illness in Hollywood was a whisper. It was exhaustion. It was nervous breakdown. It was a career-ending stigma. Patty Duke put a face on bipolar disorder. She normalized the word lithium. By going public in 1987, she saved countless lives. She gave people permission to be sick and permission to get better. She proved that you could have a severe mental illness and still be a mother, a president of a union, and a functioning human being. Her son, Sean Astin, summed up her legacy best. After her death, he launched the Patty Duke Mental Health Project. He didn't build a statue to her acting. He built a movement for her advocacy. He honored the mother, not the star. The fact that her children survived her, loved her, and honored her is the ultimate rebuke to the Rosses, who claimed she was unlovable. History must render a final verdict on John and Ethel Ross. For decades, they were viewed merely as strict managers or eccentric guardians. We must strip away those euphemisms. They were human traffickers. They utilized the legal frameworks of adoption and management to enslave a human being. They engaged in psychological torture, chemical coercion, and financial grand larceny. They are among the most prolific villains in the history of American entertainment. That they died free, wealthy, and unpunished is a stain on the justice system. But Patty Duke stripped them of their anonymity. In Call Me Anna, she ensured that history would remember them, not as the people who made her a star, but as the monsters who tried to destroy her. Let us return to the two images we imagined at the beginning of this investigation. On the left, the Oscar winner. On the right, the prisoner. For 50 years, these two images fought for control of Patty Duke's soul. The prisoner wanted to die. The star wanted to perform. But in the end, a third image emerged. It is an image of a woman in her 60s wearing comfortable clothes, sitting on a porch in Idaho surrounded by dogs. She is not smiling for a camera. She is not holding a trophy. She is simply breathing. She is Anna Marie Pierce. She survived the high-rise. She survived the needles. She survived the fame. She survived the madness. The industry stole her childhood, but they could not steal her humanity. She reclaimed her name, she reclaimed her mind, and in her final act, she reclaimed her peace. The invisible prisoner finally walked free.